Vidkun Quisling. His name means traitor. To be a Quisling is to be a Judas, and few men were more of a Nazi collaborator than this man.
A vile race of Quisling is hired to fawn upon the conqueror, to collaborate in his designs.
As Hitler's Norwegian inside man, Vidkun Quisling betrayed his country and paved the way for Nazi invasion and occupation. In return, Quisling believed Hitler would make him the Norwegian Führer. But instead, the Nazis found out he just wasn't up to it. He was incompetent and rotten at his job. So Norway, the country that Quisling claimed to love, had to be swallowed up into the Reich. Quisling was sidelined. He became a cartoon hate figure, a puppet lampooned by the Allies, despised by his countrymen, and with none of the power he so craved. How did Vidkun Quisling get it all so wrong? Was World War II's most notorious Nazi collaborator a fool, evil, or simply insane? The man whose name would become synonymous with collaboration was born in 1887 in the Telemark region of Norway. The son of a Lutheran clergyman, he had a strict upbringing. After school, he attended a military academy and became a major. Then in the 1920s, there was an event in Russia that would affect him deeply. The country was suffering a terrible famine as a result of the communist revolution and years of civil war. Vast swathes of the country became a wasteland. Disease, starvation, and poverty were everywhere. Millions died. Quisling was sent to the Ukraine to coordinate the relief effort. He worked for the League of Nations Aid Committee in Russia. He witnessed firsthand the devastation. In his eyes, suffering and inequality all prospered under communism. Nonetheless, Quisling did well in Russia. As attaché in Moscow, he represented British interests, and the British government even awarded him the CBE. But after he returned to Norway in December 1929, his views on communism became increasingly hard-line. He saw it as a menace that threatened his beloved country. Then came the Great Depression, which affected the lives of everyone. Beginning in America, it spread like a contagion across Europe. Its legacy was the financial meltdown of the whole continent. Millions lost their jobs. Crime increased and rioting spread. Norway was not immune. It was hit by a wave of strikes and civil unrest, all spawned by the Great Depression. As society collapsed, Quisling became fearful that this chaos would become a breeding ground for Norwegian communism. So, he decided to take action and enter politics, using it as a weapon to halt the spread of communism. Then in 1931, he had an unexpected break. A high-level post as Minister of Defense in the government. This was his big chance to do something in his campaign against communism. But he blew it. In June 1931, there was a communist-led strike at a Norsk Hydro industrial plant. Quisling sent in the army, and it didn't go down well. The relationship between Quisling and his fellow ministers soured. Then, after just 2 years, the government fell. Now, Quisling looked for inspiration, and he found it in Germany.
Und nun ein Wahnsinniger oder ein bewusster Lügner kann denken, dass ich oder irgendjemand jemals die Absicht hätten, Sieg heil!
January 1933. Adolf Hitler rose to power. In just 12 years, he had created a successful mass fascist movement. Quisling was smitten. The Nazis' tough stance on communism, that was what Norway so badly needed. Their idea of the great leader, the totalitarian Führer, that could be him. And the German notion of a powerful national identity, a fatherland to which everyone and everything was subjugated, that could work in Norway and unite the divided country. So, Quisling hatched a plan to create a Norwegian fascist movement, modelled exactly on the Nazis. He founded National Samling, National Union, in May 1933. As leader, Fører in Norwegian, all members had to show blind obedience to him. They adopted the Roman salute. And Quisling created his own paramilitary thugs, just like Hitler's brown shirts, known as the Herd. His party even adopted the Sun Cross as their symbol, which bore a resemblance to the swastika. Their uniforms were emblazoned with a flying eagle, just like the Nazi emblem. And in the same way as Hitler had risen to power with a 25-point plan, Quisling drew up a list of 30 things he would change. They included abolishing unemployment. He never explained how. Censoring the press, banning strikes, and the sterilization of undesirables. But Quisling differed from the Nazis in 3 key areas. He never mentioned anti-Semitism, never chose to call his party National Socialist, and he maintained party ties to Christianity. 6 months after he founded it, his fledgling NS movement was put to the test.
Norske kvinner, norske menn, å forstå sin tid, gjøre seg dens oppgaver.
Quisling hit the campaign trail, ready for the October 1933 elections.
I sin historiske tale onsdag 25. september sa den tyske rikskommissær til boken.
Unlike Hitler, he was no charismatic orator, and the elections showed it.
For en fremtidig nasjonal norsk løsning av den uværende situasjon.
His party gained just 2.2% of the vote, not a single seat in parliament, and did just a little better than their detested rivals, the communists. 3 years later, in the 1936 general election, he did even worse. National Samling had completely failed to capture popular support. It remained confined to the margins of Norwegian politics. A lunatic fringe. Then in the summer of 1939, whilst attending a conference in the German port of Lübeck, Quisling's fortunes turned. He met Alfred Rosenberg, Hitler's most senior foreign policy advisor. Rosenberg had recognized Quisling's potential as a German ally and set out to entice him to the Nazi cause. Quisling was taken on a whirlwind tour of Berlin. Meeting prominent Nazis and military figures, including Admiral Raeder, the head of the German Navy. It looked like he had finally found like-minded allies who would support him. With the help of the Nazis, he could at last become a great leader and change Norwegian politics forever. And soon, events would come together and give Quisling the opportunity to exploit his new contacts. But it would come at a heavy price. September 1939. Britain and France were forced to declare war on Germany. A dark cloud descended over the whole of Europe. The German Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, finished off Poland in just over a month. Now the German war effort needed two things: iron ore to make steel and armaments, and ships to expand its fleet. Norway offered both. Quisling quickly realized that Hitler needed the Norwegians. With Rosenberg's help, he traveled back to Berlin in December 1939 to meet more senior Nazis. This time, he had a plan. In the meeting, he set out his stall to Alfred Rosenberg. Quisling proposed to stage a coup d'etat in the capital, Oslo. He would set up a new government with himself as Führer. Then he would invite the Germans to land in Norway. The plan met with Nazi approval. To help the German landings, he gave Admiral Raeder secret intelligence regarding defense agreements with Britain and Norwegian naval forces. And he made a promise. Quisling guaranteed that the Norwegian people would support his coup. This meeting was a huge turning point in Quisling's life. He was taken right to the top to meet the Führer himself for the first time. Quisling was granted an audience with Adolf Hitler on the 14th of December 1939. Though this meeting was held behind closed doors with no minutes, Rosenberg wrote in his diary that Quisling seemed very satisfied with the talks. The Norwegian met the Führer again on the 18th, when Hitler assured him that his plan for a takeover would receive the military backing of Germany. Unbeknownst to his people back in Norway, Quisling had done a deal with the Germans. He would become Führer in Norway, and in return, allow the Germans to maintain a purely military presence to deter any British or French attacks. Quisling was overjoyed. He seemed to have the deal he needed, and his route to ultimate power appeared certain. As he flew back to Norway, the Germans were getting ready. Norwegian insurgents were trained and a list of military targets drawn up. But what Quisling didn't know was that Hitler was planning to take over Norway before he was ready. On the 3rd of April 1940, Quisling travelled to Copenhagen to meet with the deputy head of the German intelligence service. He passed over yet more military secrets to Hitler's spies. Then, less than a week later, the Germans struck.
After 7 months, the war has suddenly flared up into a tremendous conflagration with the Nazi invasion of Norway and Denmark.
Norway was invaded on the 9th of April 1940. It was a spectacular military operation that surprised everyone. Even Quisling was caught unawares. The German Navy attempted to sail right up to Oslo. And Luftwaffe transports dropped paratroopers to seize key targets. Seeing the Germans had invaded without waiting for him, Vidkun Quisling reacted and tried to regain the initiative. He seized the Oslo radio transmitter and proclaimed himself Norwegian Prime Minister. He announced that he spoke for the whole nation and called a halt to hostilities. Germany, he said, had promised to guarantee Norwegian freedom and independence, and had acted to protect her from British aggression. The move seemed to work. Hitler agreed to recognize his government immediately.
This was one of the most amazing acts of treachery the world has ever known. It brought Major Quisling international fame, making his very name synonymous with the word traitor.
Virtually overnight, Quisling was seen as a Judas around the world, especially in London. The British press in particular used his name as a byword for traitor from that moment on.
A vile race of Quislings, to use a new word which will carry the scorn of mankind down the centuries, is hired to fawn upon the conqueror, to collaborate in his designs.
But right from the start, it all went wrong for Quisling. King Håkon, the Norwegian monarch, refused to accept Quisling's government. He labeled Quisling's regime as illegitimate, and his claim to speak for the nation false. King Håkon led a fight back, first from Norway, then from London. Bitter fighting continued, especially in the north around Narvik, a vital strategic port, crucial for the transportation of iron ore. The Royal Navy fought Hitler's navy in the waters near Narvik. On land, Norwegian ground forces fought alongside British, French, and Polish troops in the mountains that surrounded the port. It was all a massive embarrassment for Quisling. It showed that he didn't have the situation under control. Despite having promised Hitler in their previous meetings that he could rally the whole country, it was patently clear that he could not. Hitler realized he would have to pacify Norway himself and he soon moved to control the situation without Quisling. Within 6 days of the invasion, Hitler put his own man in charge of Norway. Joseph Terboven was appointed Reichskommissar on the 20th of April 1940. Terboven was a man with serious Nazi pedigree, and his task was to bring Norway under direct control of the Reich. He became the supreme authority, and he was good at his job. By June 1940, all resistance ceased, and the nation capitulated. The parliament was dissolved in August. Norway, the country that Quisling had wanted to lead, was swallowed up by Hitler's empire. But Quisling wasn't quite finished. Hitler still had plans for him. Terboven was ordered by Hitler to work with Quisling and create a temporary puppet government with a facade of legality. The goal was then to build NS into a popular party and prepare Quisling for power, allowing the Germans to withdraw. Quisling chaired a cabinet formed in the autumn of 1941, known as the Council of Ministers. But behind the scenes, Terboven was firmly in charge. Together, he and Quisling set about Nazifying Norway. Now Norwegians would find out what life under the Nazis was like. Political parties were banned, as were public meetings. The press was censored, free speech outlawed, and the population was told rationing would be introduced. Quisling approved all of it. As Hitler had requested, he then went on a drive to expand his party and popularity. Once again, Vidkun Quisling hit the campaign trail. But yet again, his recruitment drive failed abysmally, even though there wasn't any political opposition. Quisling could still only muster some 20,000 out of the 100,000 members he aimed for. It was another embarrassment for the self-styled Führer, and more proof that he wasn't the popular leader he claimed to be. The Nazi strategy to build him up was failing. But he still had grand plans. In 1941, Heinrich Himmler himself had come to Oslo to see the inauguration of the Standarte Nordland, an SS military unit grouping Scandinavian volunteers in SS Division Viking. But Quisling wanted to build something bigger and better. He wanted to show Norway was indispensable to the war effort and win Hitler's favor. He offered to provide his own personal Führerguard of Norwegian volunteers. And soon there came a chance to create it. June 1941, Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's much-awaited invasion of Russia finally began. It should have been the perfect excuse for Quisling to create his own elite fighting force. But his rival Terboven beat him to it. Terboven summoned recruits for a legion of Norwegian volunteers to fight for Hitler. Similar to SS Nordland, but grander in scale, with their own national uniforms, Norwegian officers, and to placate Quisling, allegiance to him. To make the legion more appealing to Norwegians, Terboven promised they would only fight on the Finnish front. Quisling had no choice but to endorse his rival's legion, he urged all Norwegians to join. Again, volunteers were found from his paramilitaries, the Herd. 1,200 joined in total. But in the end, nothing happened as he had wanted. The unit never wore Norwegian uniforms, but German SS uniforms instead. They were made to swear an oath of allegiance not to Quisling, but to Hitler. And to make matters worse, they ended up in a dangerous hotspot on the German front line in Russia, not on the Finnish front. The Norwegian legionnaires saw action around Leningrad. There, they besieged the city for months. It was some of the toughest fighting in the whole of Russia. Many were killed in combat or by the bitter cold. What's more, the SS High Command complained about their attitude. They didn't show the proper respect for orders and suffered from poor fighting spirit. In the end, the Legion was disbanded. Not only had Quisling's idea been hijacked and the Norwegian Legion failed, but all it had achieved was to deplete the numbers of his NS party even further. The more party faithful were killed, the more his power base was shrinking. And yet again, he had failed to please the Nazis. Meanwhile, in London, events were occurring that would discredit him even more and see his grasp on power slip still further. Winston Churchill's secret army, the Special Operations Executive, had been given strict orders to start a reign of chaos in occupied Europe. It was held by the Norwegian government in exile. SOE managed to create an extremely effective network of Norwegian spies and agents known as the Home Front Army. The Home Front Army began to plan sabotage and assassinations of NS members and Nazi sympathizers. More and more young men and women escaped Norway, often making the treacherous journey by boat to sign up. They were all desperate to get rid of the unpopular Quisling. They would crew 118 ships, fly in 4 squadrons and create an army brigade numbering 1,500 men. Norwegian volunteers also trained to fight as commandos in specialist British units. Their mission was to carry out military operations deep within occupied Norwegian territory. March 1941 saw the first chance to hit back at Vidkun Quisling. British commandos targeted the Lofoten Islands. They took with them the men they trained.
We have also on board Norwegian soldiers and sailors, men picked for their physique and initiative, their dash and enterprise, men brought to the peak of military efficiency by long and intensive training, and in high spirits too, for they're bound for their home country, Norway, to strike at the enemy in occupation.
The targets were tanks of fish oil used to make explosives. The The operation was a tactical and propaganda success.
And that's Hitler's cod liver oil going up instead of down. Stacks of barrels of the precious liquid, vital for the Nazi war machine, are broken open and tipped into the harbor. Other parties have different work to do. The rounding up of Germans and Quislings and marching them off for interrogation.
Over 300 new volunteers left the islands and joined the convoy to fight for the Allies. The raiders even made a joke at Hitler's expense and sent a telegram teasing the Führer before they left.
Herr Hitler, reference your last speech. I thought you said that whenever British troops land on the continent of Europe, German soldiers will face them. Well, where are they?
300,000 German troops, badly needed elsewhere, had to be garrisoned in Norway doing nothing, simply to deter further Allied raids. Despite this, all Quisling's efforts seemed, on the surface, to be rewarded on the 1st of February 1942, when he became Minister-President, the head of state, even though Norway was still officially part of the Reich. He had all the trappings of power, a title, a sumptuous residence, and his head on the national postage stamp. But Quisling effectively remained on probation. Terboven was still in charge. He was a puppet, and his new puppet title came at a price, as Quisling became the figurehead of a clampdown and was forced to turn on his own people. Throughout 1942, the British attacks against Norway continued. And it wasn't just the commando raiders who inconvenienced Quisling. The Home Front Army resistance movement inside Norway was growing in strength. Its campaign of sabotage and assassinations was working. Their most famous achievement, later immortalized on film, was the partial destruction of the Norsk Hydro heavy water plant in Telemark. It was one of a number of daring attacks right under the Minister-President's nose. Terboven was furious that the Home Front Army could act with impunity. Quisling was at a loss how to react. Desperate to be taken seriously and bullied by Terboven, Quisling agreed to brutal reprisals. 6 commandos captured trying to sabotage the heavy water plant on a previous mission were executed. Murdering uniformed special forces was a war crime, which went against the Geneva Convention. Then, to contain the Norwegian resistance, innocent civilians became fair game. They were rounded up and tortured. Quisling let it happen. Nazi recriminations were particularly brutal at the hands of a notorious ex-Norwegian soldier named Henry Renan. Renan worked for the SS secret police, the SD. He led a gang of 40 Gestapo agents who infiltrated resistance networks. 1,000 people were arrested. Hundreds were murdered. Then in October 1942, Quisling went even further. He cooperated with the crime that made the Nazis so infamous. In Oslo, 750 Jews were arrested and deported to the Auschwitz death camp. their property and wealth was stolen. Quisling's involvement made him even more unpopular. In the eyes of Norwegians, he had now sold his soul. In 1943, he made things even worse by advocating compulsory conscription. As head of state, he declared that Norway was at war with Russia and allied to the Reich. He wanted to pass an unpopular law allowing the Norwegian population to be called up to help the German war effort. He submitted plans to SS Chief Gottlob Berger for 75,000 conscripts. Norwegians were recruited to fight in German ski Jaeger units in Finland. Others were sent off to labor camps in Germany. In 1944, he tried to mobilize yet more young Norwegians for compulsory labor service. Then he made his next fateful mistake. A popular Norwegian police chief, Gunnar Eilifsen, refused to execute 2 girls who had avoided compulsory labor service. The police chief was killed for insubordination. Minutes from a meeting with Terboven show that Quisling justified the use of capital punishment. Quisling's behavior was all the more incomprehensible, given the way the war was going. "1944 was a year of unmissable signs that the Reich would soon be finished. Over that summer, Germany suffered 2 simultaneous body blows. In the west, the Allies landed in Normandy. In the east, Russia's Operation Bagration obliterated a huge portion of the forces on the Eastern Front. All the other Hitler collaborators around Europe had gone by now too. Mussolini, Italy's fascist dictator. Antonescu, the former ally in Romania. Admiral Horthy, regent in Hungary. Fritz Clausen, collaborator in neighboring Denmark. The writing was on the wall for those who supported the Third Reich. Even the Führer himself had been the target of an assassination plot and coup. Yet Quisling refused to turn back. Bizarrely, it was only at this moment, as the Reich was collapsing, that Adolf Hitler finally had quality time for him. Even though the end seemed inevitable, he was summoned to meet Himmler and Hitler again in January 1945. The Nazis pulled out all the stops. Quisling saw Hitler no fewer than 3 times during his official state visit. He was whisked off to meet Goebbels and Ribbentrop too. At long last, he was finally being treated as a proper head of state. Quisling seemed to recover some of his statesmanship. He was determined to try and do a deal with Hitler one last time, to finally negotiate with him and regain independence for Norway. His idea was for a grand alliance uniting all Germanic peoples after the war. In exchange for its membership, a peace had to be signed with Norway, guaranteeing its independence. But Quisling's plan was hopeless. It depended on Germany winning the war, which was clearly not going to happen.
Dead Nazis and captured Nazis, men dazed and bewildered by the fury of the Allied attack. As the Russians sweep on, Germany sees certain doom on two fronts.
To make matters worse, Hitler was enraged by continued acts of sabotage in Norway and refused to accept any such treaty. Quisling's plan was rejected. From this point on, Quisling's actions became more and more delusional. In the dying days of the war, he offered citizenship to 400,000 German soldiers in Norway. He even suggested the idea of making Norway a fortress, Festung Norway, somewhere the Nazis could make a last stand against the Allies. But it was all too late.
The day of victory in Europe was the day of freedom for Norway, isolated from her allies since 1940. The first British party to enter Oslo is greeted by the chief of the German ground forces, putting up an oily show of friendship which is coldly rejected.
On the 8th of May 1945, the German army in Norway surrendered. The 40,000 home front forces emerged from hiding and joined the liberators. The Nazi regime was finished. Joseph Terboven blew himself up in a bunker with a hand grenade. But Vidkun Quisling remained in a dream world. Incredibly, he thought he could form a working relationship with the home front forces. He received a curt reply from King Haakon's representatives. Hand yourself in, or expect to be taken by force. The next day, a dazed and confused Quisling handed himself in at an Oslo police station. It was now time for retribution. Those Norwegians who had sided with the Nazis had to face their judgment. Henry Rinnan, the brutal police enforcer, faced his fate with a chilling smile. But Norway's former leader tried to put up a fight. In August, Quisling's trial began. It was held in a temporary courthouse in Oslo, created especially for the occasion. The eyes of the world's media were focused on Norway. Quisling welcomed the chance to set the record straight. He wanted to explain how the Norwegian people had got it all wrong, how he had tried to protect them from Terboven, not act as an agent of the Nazis. The prosecution was so bemused by Quisling's reasoning that they had him assessed to see if he was insane. The psychiatrists eventually determined he was not. He was charged with treason, orchestrating a coup, ordering Norwegian soldiers to down arms, and assisting Germany's war efforts and occupation. What's more, he stood accused of killing Norwegian patriots, like the police chief, Eilifsen. The prosecution called for the death penalty. Quisling would never accept he had done anything wrong. He maintained he had always tried to secure Norwegian independence. As his trial went on, more evidence began to stack up against him. Theft and embezzlement were also added to the list of crimes. But questioning quickly returned to his contacts with German Nazis and the matter of treason. Especially his meeting in Copenhagen, days before the invasion. Quisling flatly refused to admit any knowledge of the meeting and denied any prior knowledge of an invasion. Later, further evidence was submitted proving that he had met with Admiral Raeder, who had planned the German invasion of Norway. Quisling hit back with some impressive character witnesses who spoke up in his defense, but they could not defend his actions under the Nazis. His defense collapsed. Then, a key Jewish witness delivered more damning evidence. Leo Eitinger spoke at length about the deportation and gassing of Norwegian Jews. Quisling had been complicit in their deaths. In his final statement, he said, "I have been guided by two considerations: my love of Norway and my love of the Norwegian people." The judges withdrew to contemplate the verdict. Vidkun Quisling was sentenced to death on the 10th of September 1945. He had been found guilty of treason, murder, and theft. He was in shock. On the morning of the 24th of October 1945, Quisling was led to a courtyard at Akershus fortress, where a firing squad similar to this one awaited. He was blindfolded and prepared for death. As the shots rang out, Vidkun Quisling protested his innocence one last time. Right until the moment of death, Vidkun Quisling remained convinced he had done nothing wrong. But the truth was different. In fact, he was almost driven mad by his own contradictions. He was the patriot who betrayed his country, the nationalist who let his country be taken over, the man who loved his people but also oppressed them. He was the figurehead who claimed to speak for a whole nation but spoke for no one. A man of faith who was complicit in the murder of Jews. Vidkun Quisling was convinced he could rally millions, but failed. And thought he could deal with Adolf Hitler, and was wrong. In the end, these contradictions tore him apart, and he paid for them with his life.